Exclusives have been a part of this game since very early on. In fact, they were a thing as early as 2017 with the likes of Oh My. These variants have always shared one facet in common: they're very scarce and difficult to acquire. So they're often treated as trophies, achievements for your commitment to the game, or rather because you got stupidly lucky. Either that or you were able to cheese the system. They always intrigued me. How come these ridiculously difficult to get variants are rarely ever good? Well, the easy answer is balance reasons. As laughable as that is to say. But also, it does reinforce to some degree their trophy status. To the point, this video will give some insight into all of the exclusives available in the game. But we gotta set one key distinction before moving on. As most of you may be aware of, Hidden Variable has made the decision of releasing 6 new variants once every 3 months. They're made available during 1 month and locked away during 8 or so. I've seen some people label them as exclusive, but I'm afraid those are not included in this video, for the simple reason that once they're actually released, they become regular variants you can obtain. At most they're described as timed exclusives, which can be disorienting, but nonetheless excluded. Also, I'm not gonna bother with the usual rating shit this time around, more than anything because this is more a for fun kind of project, and to also highlight the methods of acquisition rather than their place in the meta. I'll still talk about whether they're usable or not, don't worry. Within exclusives, we can separate them between 2 categories: Elemental and Special. We'll start with the former because they're easy enough to understand. Elemental exclusives all share the same method of regular acquisition. They will show up in elemental relics that happen to match their element. So in our threat's case, she'll be in sunken relics because they're both water typed. Usually they're pretty difficult to get your hands on because they never show up in any relics outside of their own, so you cannot rely on gold relics to narrow down your odds. However, they occasionally make apparitions on monthly relics. They tend to get overshadowed by the new thing revealed that season, but it's a good reward for those that may not have that variant. As a matter of fact, that's how I managed to obtain my elemental exclusives. Not once I was able to do it through the conventional means, so it goes to show they're damn slippery. Idle Threat tends to be the most sought after between the elemental exclusives. Objectively, she's the best one because of the reference. And also thanks to Philia's kit being cracked. Had she been rated exclusively on her ability, it would have been much worse. It relies on Philia's niche gimmick of evades, not the buff itself, but rather backdashing to avoid any incoming hits. This is very tricky to pull off ordinarily. It's not something that can apply to every move in the game, but pulling it off has a degree of satisfaction, and all you get for a skill display is a measly armor stack and final stand. I mean, bonus points for survivability, I guess. At least that allows you to play more carefree for a few seconds, but it barely impacts the fight in any meaningful way, and it's not like it's useful on defense. If nothing else, the second ability tends to catch a lot more attention, as it's leech on steroids, for 1 or 2 hits. Having it tied to dash attacks is the major downside, but otherwise the levels of instant recovery this achieves are insane. If you thought Trichobisaur's recovery total was crazy, try one of these with Idle Threat. Pyro-Technique was the one that to some extent maybe delayed this video. For the main purpose, I actually wanted to see if I got her before working on this project. I ultimately said fuck it, as you can see. Does it make me a fraud? Did my credibility as a lucky asshole vanish? Well, guess what? I actually had her, and can her to evolve a Surgeon General. Her ability is mostly fine, nothing outstanding, but not bad either. Blockbusters and special hits have 20% odds of landing weather, and while the opponent suffers from it, your hits have 20% odds of granting enrage. It's rather basic and forgettable. Hell, most people can run Biohazard, and it does a better job at meter removal. But to be fair, it's also bugged, so the enrage is also just there. If nothing else, it helps her gain an extra boost when it comes to attack, and land devastating counter venoms. Otherwise, there really isn't much to comment on Pyro. Fun variant, and that's really it. I recently reviewed Starcrust in a previous video. Recently. And I was pretty harsh on her, because despite being able to make use of Parasol's kit, she was incredibly annoying to make any use of. She depends a lot on well-timed blocks, and whether she can land a stun or not is determined by basically a coin toss. Also, her damage increase applies to blockbusters only, and against stunned enemies. She may come across as similar to that of Idle Threat, where both feature great base kits, but happen to be vastly overshadowed by more accessible variants. The difference is that Philia's kit is much easier to apply in any situation, because Ringlet, Spike and Leech fuck over the competition for days. Needless to say, I don't find Starcrust all that fun to use, not even after some time has passed to give it some extra thought. And no, using Egret Dive to make it faster does not make her any better. Grim Fan could be considered as just the other yellow Painwheel. She exists and attempts to fill a niche, and not very successfully at that. Her health needs to be lowered to 50% so she can gain unflinching and immunity, and once unflinching expires, all teammates will be revived. It's not a common method of revival, and maybe for good reason it isn't. Both her unflinching and immunity last 15 seconds. That's more than enough time to counter her in whichever way you like. To her credit, you can use any source of unflinching for her revival, but there's not that many external sources you can profit. At most they'll come from prize fights or rift battle effects. I know what you're thinking, what about a short duration the Angry Flinch? Wouldn't that be effective? And sure, it could have some effects, but at the same time, you can just kill Grimfan first and get rid of the problem. Needless to say, she's pretty bad to make any use of, even if you just want to fuck around and find out. Megasonic comes close to being a competent big band, which is not a common sight. Mind you, he's still vastly inferior to most options out there, mainly any affiliate you can think of. But you could say he's at least passable. He takes very little damage on blocked hits, and these grant him Enrage and Thorns. The Thorns don't really do much, given he's a more offense-oriented band. At most it punishes careless players and people that rely too much on Neuromancer. Part of his selling point would be the low chip damage he takes on block. It's a good demonstration on heavy block proficiency, but people tend to think of Megasonic more for his recovery. While he benefits from Enrage, any hit will recover a total of 50% of the damage dealt. Hence the Philia comparison. It's definitely more than you could say for most bands. Unfortunately, his enrages are lost on hit, so you either carry the most ideal moves for the job, or simply slot in a support. The latter option lets you experiment with him more often, so I'd roll with that. Either way, if you have played Philia, then you also have played with Megasonic, so you're not missing much. Special exclusives are far more involved in their acquisition methods. They're never available in any standard relic. Normally you can buy your way into them, and the most likely way you'll have access to some of these is the Parallel Realms recruitment system. Some of them are easy enough to acquire regardless of their excessive rarity. Others are absurd to the point of not being worth bothering, even if their abilities are actually good. So how do they stack up compared to the elementals? About the same level if you ask me, but let's examine them more closely. Oh My was one of the first exclusives to be added in the game, and kickstarted the strangest trend possible. Fire-type Valentines must be hard as balls to obtain. Originally she was given as part of the Welcome Pack, a very old offer that ran during the earliest days of the game. Then in patch 2.0, she was made available in daily relics. 1% odds though. If nothing else, she has usually shown up on every Valentine's Day prize fight going forward.
You son of a bitch!
Ability wise, she's very so-so, relying primarily on deaths as her source of damage. It's similar to Flytrap, but instead of a permanent attack boost, it's a 15 to 20 second enrage, depending on either teammate or enemy death. It makes her a lesser effective Pyro-Technique, since she gets her enrages on overly separate intervals. The good news is that teammate deaths grant whoever goes to the field next 2 enrages. The bad news, this doesn't apply on enemy deaths unless Oh My is the active fighter, so she doesn't work as a full-on attack support. Not without sacrifice anyway. The silver lining sort of is her access to precision on kill, which is actually very effective on the hands of a Valentine, giving counter Venom's output, and you can hold on to them for longer with mortuary drops. Its scarcity makes her less viable compared to other common precision killers. I guess she's average, fun for a few hours, but then you realize she's mostly ass, and not worth evolving like 7 times. Really good palette though, I'll give her that. They capture the essence of the reference if you catch my drift. Necrobreaker used to be the main rare reward given out during contests, giveaways and anything else. And while that holds true to some degree, she's been largely replaced by fan favorite and number cruncher. Nowadays, the only way to get your hands on one of these is during Halloween prize fight, by finishing them on the top 10%. Sounds reasonable. The only downside is that it's only once a year, but otherwise, she's mostly guaranteed. unless they give her the Oh My treatment. Her ability is a mix of offensive and defensive, featuring a failsafe final stand that works identical to Last Words. You could think of it as an alternate shadow puppet, since it may leave you vulnerable in some contexts, but safer in others. But her main attraction is the infinite recovery by charging Wyrm's tail. Just as it sounds, any health you lost can be manually recovered, but you must leave yourself open to do so. Not like it matters much. Her biggest drawback is her awful attack, second worst in the game, only ahead of Scared Stiff. She's barely considered for any contexts. Even during Don't Poke the Beer's golden days, she wasn't considered because she leaves herself open too much. She's fine for a few runs or two, but you're likely going to ditch her afterwards. Inner Pieces might be the contender for the most meta-viable exclusive. She also has potentially the easiest method of obtaining her, gold gifts. But it all depends on how often your friends send you said gold gifts. Okay, let's check out who I got as gifts, good friends. We have the Peacock Obsessed one, the guy I stole every Ultra Killed record from, Super Nintendo Chalmers, one of those elite guys or whatever that Mongolian basket weaving forum is. The second guy that wants me banned, and Chie Satonaka. And who could forget Mimage Boy? Yeah, it's good company, alright? Her ability can only be described as a baton pass from Pokemon, where any active buffs are transferred on tag-in from or to Inner Pieces. This can lead to an absurd amount of experimentation with the right variants. The most typical is using anything within Rage Access like Thrill Shrieker, then passing it through Inner Pieces to someone that has special capabilities with it, such as Psychomander, Risky Ginger, Persona Assistant, and many others. Not only that, she's capable of gaining buffs of her own whenever a segment blockbuster is used. The buffs depend entirely on the teammate's element. Here's a chart for convenience. But otherwise this doubles down on her offense and support potential. Offense thanks to Enrage and Regen being available. Support because she can gain a series of buffs, then transfer them to someone else. She demands heavy experimentation to see what works best. But no question she's very practical and fun to use. One can only be thankful she was made this accessible. A smash hit all around. Unlike the source of its reference. Now we're getting to the territory where things get downright stupid. Fan Favorite and Number Cruncher are the two most difficult to obtain variants in the entire game, because of how overly inaccessible they've been made. Fan Favorite was actually given for free during Skullgirls Mobile's 5th year anniversary. I evolved him on that very same day. If you weren't able to obtain him via this method, unlucky you fucking shithead. Your other pathway to him is through giveaways hosted on whatever channels the devs choose. And because they have my sorry ass shadow banned in terms of promotion, the devs occasionally do streams themselves, either on Twitch or yeah right, like that's gonna fucking happen. The other way of getting your hands on him is going to a live booth at a convention, usually EVO, and usually anywhere in the US. If you're European, Asian, or a BB chugger, then you're pretty much fucked. The other alternative you have is either art or combo contests, although I haven't seen the latter in a long while, so it's with a heavy asterisk. For art contests, it's a lot of effort if what you seek are just a bunch of exclusives. But hey, that might be copium for my non-existent art skills. As for his ability, there's not that much to comment about. He's very basic and mildly effective. He works as an attacker and support. Attacker because Hype Mode will grant him 2 enrage stacks and inflict death mark. It's good for what it is. It allows for stronger hits with Hurdle or Gigantic Arm. Support since he grants a 10-second final stand to teammates every 30 seconds. Again, very basic and it works as a failsafe, but only on given intervals. If you get your hands on Fan Favorite, don't expect to have the Beowulf experience of the century, but he'll be enjoyable for an hour or two. Number Cruncher shares the same requirements of acquisition as Fan Favorite, but it's worth mentioning that she's made even more scarce thanks to not being given away for free during the 5th anniversary. By far the most gate-kept variant in the entire game. And I got my hands on her. No dev hacks or anything. How does this fat bitch, with unfavorable schedules, no will to make a TikTok account, and even less to travel to the US for a bunch of pixels on a screen, manage to get her? I just had an outside contact, major shoutouts to Flummery, forever grateful for the deed. Anyhow, originally I was rather harsh on Number Cruncher, and once I was able to try her for a few rounds, I've become somewhat more forgiving on her. She's still not good though. The first problem is that her blessing stacks are tied to a 50% chance. The 5 combo requirement is obviously not hard to meet, but it's common to miss again because of bad luck. And once you reach 5 blessing stacks, these are removed to inflict 5 guard break stacks on the opponent. On paper this sounds cool, and I'll admit, it's fun to constantly lock the opponent. But here's the problem. If you haven't played with Number Cruncher, you don't really need to. In fact, you may have played a better version without realizing. Because for all intents and purposes, this is a worse Persona assistant. This is what ultimately stings the most about Number Cruncher. She feels like a poor copycat of a variant that happens to be underutilized too. I understand she cannot be overpowered, but I still wish she did something more than just Persona Assistant 2, you know?
¿Sabes con qué me gustan los huevos? Con huevos.
So what did we learn today? Nothing whatsoever, but we got to see a bunch of rare shit in action. I don't think there's much to do regarding exclusive variants. It hurts to say, especially given the likes of Number Cruncher being very hard to access. But they're just fine as is. After all, it should be treated as trophies and not much more. If some of these were meta, the game would plummet even harder. The only exception to this happens to be Inner Pieces, but that's because she's also the most accessible. In conclusion, if you happen to have one of these, make sure to show them off whenever possible. It's not gonna impress anyone, you fucking twat, but you go do it anyway. Thank God they ported the pellets to Second Encore. At least we can use them on the better game.
あやが今一番会いたい文化人は
文化人
では正解の発表です。
猿。